Welcome to Line Upon Line with Pastor Gio, building faith one truth at a time.
For more than 160 years, Seventh-day Adventists have warned that Sunday legislation would one day become a test of religious liberty. Critics said it could never happen in America, but in 2026, an influential policy organization proposed something remarkably specific: laws establishing a uniform day of rest centered on Sunday. Then the Seventh-day Adventist Church issued an official warning. Is this the beginning of prophecy's fulfillment, or are believers moving faster than the evidence? Today, in part one, we're going to examine exactly what has happened, what Ellen White actually predicted, and just as importantly, what has not yet happened. Then in part two, we will put denominational claims aside and ask the decisive question: can the Seventh-day Adventist understanding of the Sabbath, Sunday worship, the sign of God, and the final crisis actually be established from the Bible alone? Because this story is real, but understanding it requires something increasingly rare: discernment without sensationalism. Welcome to Line Upon Line, where we examine scripture, history, and prophecy carefully, precept upon precept, and line upon line. If you value serious Bible study without fabricated headlines or unnecessary fear, subscribe and follow this two-part investigation through to its conclusion. So, on January 8th, 2026, the Heritage Foundation published a major policy report titled "Saving America by Saving the Family." The Heritage Foundation is not a church. It's an influential American policy organization whose proposals are frequently discussed by conservative lawmakers, activists, and government officials. The report addressed marriage, children, work, education, religious participation, and the condition of the American family. But within the report was a section with a particularly important title: Support for a Uniform Day of Rest. The authors argued that communities should consider laws limiting commercial activity on a common rest day, and the day repeatedly identified in the discussion was Sunday. The report pointed to blue laws that still exist in parts of the United States. It mentioned businesses and institutions that already close on Sunday. It also argued that a shared day of rest could strengthen families, encourage religious participation, and improve social cohesion. At first glance, these goals may sound entirely positive. Who could object to families spending more time together? Who could object to overworked employees receiving time to rest? Who could object to communities slowing down for one day each week? Rest is good. Strong families are good. Healthy communities are good. But there's a deeper question. Who chooses the day? And what happens to the minority when the government gives legal preference to a day carrying religious significance for the majority? For Seventh-day Adventists, this is not an abstract question. Adventists observe the Seventh-day Sabbath from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. If commercial activity is legally restricted on Sunday as well, Sabbath keepers could experience a unique burden. A small business owner might close on Saturday because of biblical conviction and then be required to close again on Sunday because of civil law. An employee could confront the same difficulty. What appears to be the majority as one protected rest day could become two restricted workdays for the minority. This is where a seemingly beneficial policy begins to raise the serious questions of religious liberty. The controversy is not over whether people need rest. The controversy is whether the government should select a religiously significant day and increasingly organize public life around it. 10 days after the Heritage Report was published, the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists issued an official response. The statement warned that legally enforcing a uniform day of rest represented a troubling disregard for religious freedom. The church acknowledged the value of rest and strong families, but it rejected the idea that government should impose a particular day upon the public. The distinction is important. Religious liberty means more than allowing people to enter a church building. It means protecting a person's right to worship or not worship according to conscience. A government may begin by restricting shopping. It may begin by closing certain businesses. It may begin by describing the policy as secular, economic, or family-centered. But once the state establishes a common day possessing clear religious significance, the boundary between persuasion and coercion begins to weaken. No government needs to command people to pray before religious liberty becomes relevant. If the law disadvantages people because their convictions require them to observe a different day, conscience has already entered the discussion. That does not prove that every advocate of Sunday rest intends to persecute religious minorities. Many supporters may sincerely want healthier families, improved mental health, greater religious participation, or protection for workers. The issue is not necessarily the private motive of every supporter. The issue is the power being placed in the hands of the state. Good intentions cannot transform religious coercion into religious liberty. Why did this proposal immediately attract Adventist attention? Because the modern Seventh-day Adventist movement was born during a period when Sunday legislation was a real political controversy in America. Ellen White and other early Adventists saw organized efforts to give Sunday observance the support of civil law. Adventists were not discussing an imaginary scenario. Some Sabbath keepers were fined, arrested, and imprisoned under Sunday laws, not necessarily because they prevented anyone else from worshiping, but because they worked on Sunday after resting on Saturday. This history shaped the Adventist defense of liberty of conscience. It also explains why Ellen White repeatedly warned about the relationship between Sunday observance and civil power. In the Great Controversy, she predicted that political leaders in America would eventually yield to a popular demand for a law enforcing Sunday observance. Notice the predicted sequence. The movement would gain public support. Religious interests would seek assistance from civil government. Political leaders would eventually consider Sunday legislation advantageous or necessary, and the conscience of the minority would be sacrificed to the will of the majority. Ellen White also wrote, "The Sunday movement is now making its way in darkness." She explained that its leaders could conceal the true issue and that many people joining the movement right now may not recognize what the undercurrent was heading. That statement deserves careful consideration. She did not claim that every person advocating Sunday rest consciously intended to oppose God. Many people could be sincere about it. Their stated goals could appear mild, moral, compassionate, and Christian, but a movement must be judged by more than its original presentation. We must also examine the principles it establishes and the direction in which those principles can lead. Suppose that Sunday restrictions were introduced with this argument. Families are collapsing, workers are exhausted, communities are fragmented, church participation is declining, people are lonely, anxious, and spiritually homeless. Therefore, society needs a shared day of rest to worship, for family, and for community. That argument may appeal to millions of people. It offers a simple response to complicated social problems. But what happens to the person whose conscience identifies a different day as sacred? At first, that person may merely appear unusual. Later, that person may be described as someone who doesn't want to get along. If the policy is presented as necessary for workers, families, children, mental health, morality, or national renewal, those who resist it could eventually be accused of opposing the common good. The question would quietly change. Instead of asking, does government possess the right to privilege a religious significant day? People may begin asking, why won't these minority cooperate with something that benefits everyone? That is how a question of conscience can be transformed into a question of social loyalty. Ellen White warned that Sabbath keepers would eventually be portrayed as enemies of law and order. They will be blamed for social instability and accused of preventing the restoration of divine favor. Whether the present proposal will develop in that direction remains to be seen, but the underlying principle deserves attention now. Rights are most effectively defended before the majority decides that restricting them has become necessary. At this point, we must ask an essential distinction. The Heritage Foundation report is not national Sunday law. It does not force Americans to attend church. It does not currently prohibit Seventh-day Adventists from keeping the Seventh-day Sabbath. It does not establish a national religious test, and it is not by itself the complete fulfillment of the crisis described by Adventist prophecy. It is a policy proposal encouraging communities to consider uniform rest laws and restrictions on commercial activity. That is significant, though, but it is not the entire prophetic scenario. We must avoid two opposite errors. The first error is to ignore the development. A prominent policy organization has placed Sunday-centered rest laws back into serious public discussion. The North American division considered the matter significant enough to issue an official warning. Those facts should not be dismissed. But the second error is to declare that prophecy has been completely fulfilled when the predicted crisis has not yet arrived. No one should use this report to set dates. No one should claim that everyone who worships on Sunday has received the mark of the beast. And no one should manufacture fear to attract views. Millions of sincere Christians worship on Sunday because they believe they are honoring Jesus. They are not our enemies. The danger is not a person peacefully worshiping God according to conscience. The danger appears when religious observance receives the coercive power of the state. That distinction will become extremely important in part 2. At this stage, an honest viewer may object. You have shown what Ellen White predicted. You have shown what the Adventist church believed. But where does the Bible teach any of this? That is the right question. Seventh-day Adventists should never be afraid of it. A doctrine cannot become biblically merely because Ellen White wrote about it. If the Adventist interpretation is true, its foundation must be found in Scripture. So in part 2, we temporarily set Ellen White aside. We will examine the case from the Bible itself. We will ask, why does Scripture call the Sabbath a sign? What is the relationship between a sign and a seal in Romans 4:11? What happens in Ezekiel chapter 8 and 9 when sun worship appears in the temple and God places a mark upon those who remain faithful? How does the Old Testament judgment scene help us understand the signs and marks found in Revelation chapters 13 and 14? Why does Revelation contrast the mark of the beast with people who keep the commandments of God? And does the Bible identify Sunday as the Christian Sabbath, or does that claim come from somewhere else? We will also examine an often overlooked moment in the trial of Jesus. Luke tells us that Herod and Pilate had previously been enemies, but became friends on the day Jesus was condemned. One represented political authority. The other ruled the Jewish territory and participated in the religious controversies surrounding Christ. Their former hostility was overcome through their shared treatment of Jesus. Does this provide a pattern of religious and political interests uniting against the authority of Christ? We will allow Scripture to answer. Then we will look at statements from Roman Catholic sources concerning the historical change from Sabbath to Sunday. This involves what historians and legal thinkers sometimes call the principle of embarrassment, or an admission against interest. When a source acknowledges a fact that does not appear to strengthen its arguments, that admission may carry unusual evidentiary weight. But we will not accept or reject those statements merely because they come from Catholics. We will test the historical claims against Scripture. The question in part 2 will not be, what does one denomination say? The question will be, what does the Bible actually teach? While we wait to see how the current Sunday rest proposal develops, Ellen White's counsel does not direct believers towards panic, hatred, or reckless defiance. She urged God's people to understand the issue, explain their faith, reduce unnecessary prejudice, defend liberty of conscience, and remain engaged in earnest work. That leaves us with several responsibilities. First, investigate before sharing. Read the proposal itself. Read the official Adventist response. Do not build your convictions entirely upon alarming titles or short social media clips. Second, defend religious liberty for everyone. If Adventists demand liberty only for Adventists, they have misunderstood the principle. Freedom of conscience must also protect Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, atheists, and others with whom we may strongly disagree. Third, refuse to demonize Sunday-keeping Christians. A person peacefully attending church on Sunday is not the prophetic enemy. The issue is not individual sincerity. The issue is the union of religious authority with coercive civil power. Fourth, Prepare spiritually. Prophecy was not given merely to make us informed spectators. It was given to produce faithful disciples. Knowing that a crisis may come is useless if we're not learning to follow God today. So, has the Sunday law begun? Not in its complete prophetic form. There is no national law currently forcing Americans to worship on Sunday, and the final test anticipated by Seventh-day Adventists has not arrived. But something important has changed. A prominent policy organization has recommended uniform rest laws and identified Sunday as their practical center. The North American division of Seventh-day Adventists has responded with an official religious liberty warning, and ideas many Americans regard as belonging to the past have re-entered serious public discussion. We should neither exaggerate those facts nor ignore them. The proposal does not prove that every detail of Adventist prophecy is true, but it raises the questions with renewed force. Could a Sunday law really return to America? Ellen White said it would, but should anyone believe that prediction simply because Ellen White said it? No. If the warning is true, the foundation must be in the Bible. That is where we're going next. In part 2, we will investigate the biblical evidence behind the Adventist position. We will connect the Sabbath as God's sign with the biblical relationship between a sign and a seal. We will examine sun worship and the divine mark in Ezekiel chapter 8 and 9. We will compare that judgment scene with the mark of the beast and the commandments of God in Revelation chapters 13 and 14. We will investigate the union represented when Herod and Pilate became friends during the trial of Jesus. And we will ask why Catholic authorities have openly claimed responsibility for the change from Sabbath to Sunday. Most importantly, we will ask whether Sunday sacredness can actually be demonstrated from Scripture. Part 1 has shown us the modern warning. Part 2 will test the foundation. Before watching Part 2, answer this question in the comments. If the Bible never transferred the holiness of the seventh day to Sunday, who possesses the authority to make that change? Keep the discussion respectful. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss Part 2. The Sabbath, Sunday worship, and the final crisis, a strictly biblical investigation. Here at Line Upon Line, we do not ask you to accept a doctrine simply because a church teaches it. We open the Bible and examine it, precept upon precept, line upon line. Until next time, God bless.